Hello, I'm Robert Holmberg. I'm a member of Science Outreach Athabasca, and this is a presentation about biting flies, vampires of the north. There are four parts to this presentation, and this one is the introduction. So the topics covered in this part is what are biting flies, what they look like, and why are they important. And the second part will be just on mosquitoes. The third part will be on black flies, no-see-ums, horse flies, snipe flies, some musket flies, and some other flies that suck blood. And the fourth part will be on avoiding bites and killing biting flies. Okay, so first of all, we have to think about what are flies. Well, they're animals like we are, but they're arthropods. They have an external exoskeleton, and they have um, uh, jointed appendages and jointed body parts. They're insects, so they have six legs, and most of them have wings. And they are holometabolists or complete metamorphosis. So all insects go through an egg stage, a larval stage, and an adult stage. But in those with complete metamorphosis, like the flies, they have a pupal stage as well. And this means that there's usually a separation of the adults and the larvae in terms of their ecological niches. So the larvae often feed on different things than the adults feed on. And they're in the order Diptera, the true flies. Diptera meaning two wings. And I've used this picture of a crane flag because a lot of people come to me and say they caught this large mosquito with a couple of centimeters across, but it's usually turns out to be of the family Tipulidae, the crane flies, and they're perfectly harmless. They don't bite at all. Okay, how diverse are flies? This pie chart shows all of the animals in the animal kingdom. You can see the arthropods are the vast majority of things, over 80%, and the insects are a huge part of that. And the biggest group are the beetles at the bottom, and then there's the butterflies and moths, and then there are the wasps, ants, and bees, the Hymenoptera, and then we come to the flies, the Diptera. And you can see that the Diptera have more species than all the chordates and the mammals put together. And there's estimates vary between 90,000 to 150,000 species of flies. Now, the flies are divided up into two major groups, the Nematosphera and the Brachyocera. These are fancy names for sort of light-bodied flies and heavy-bodied flies. There are various technical differences, but the ones on the left are the Nematosphera, and those have fairly elongate bodies and fairly proportionally longer legs, while the ones on the right, the Brachycera, have fairly stout bodies and relatively shorter legs in general. So if we look at the Nematosphera, the biting flies are the mosquitoes, black flies, and no-see-ums, and they're in these two groups circled on this diagram. And in the Brachycera, there are also three groups, the horse flies, the snipe flies, and a couple of musket flies, and they're also in these two groups that are circled. So what are biting flies? Well, the adult females or both sexes feed on blood. There are other flies that have biting mouth parts, but they don't feed on blood, and so they're not considered biting flies, even though they do bite to feed as adults and as larval stages as well. But the mouth parts are specialized for penetrating skin and sucking blood. So it's not a chewing mechanism. And the hosts are mainly terrestrial vertebrates. They are attracted to their host by heat, and And even if they're a cold-blooded animal host, there's also chemicals that attract them. And most have aquatic or semi-aquatic eggs, larvae, and even pupal stages, but the adults are terrestrial. Okay, the hosts are varied. There's mammals of all kinds, there are birds of all kinds, and there are reptiles such as this snake. And you would think that reptiles with their scales couldn't be penetrated, but these mosquitoes are feeding in between the scales and getting the blood for themselves. Also amphibians such as frogs and fish that come up out of the water for a while. There's a few of those, and they get fed on as well. And there's also insects that are attacked in some groups. Okay, so the mouth parts are modified for basically sucking fluids in both sexes. The top diagram shows a male mosquito. You can see the antennae are quite plumose, hairy, and they have mouth parts that can suck nectar. The female is below. Her antennae is a little less plumose, and her mouth parts can suck fluids as well. So here's a scanning electron micrograph that's enhanced with artificial coloring to show the various parts. And you can see the real mouth parts are outlined in red, and they're in this sheath. So the mouth parts form, they're not full tubes, but they overlap one another to form tubes. And there's two different ducts. One is for conducting saliva into the host for the anticoagulants and sometimes anesthetics, and then another tube is formed to suck the blood up. But it's made of insects usually have 7 mouth parts, so it's quite complex. And this diagram shows 3 biting flies and 1 non-biting fly. So the top left is showing the horsefly, the top right is showing a mosquito, the bottom right is a tsetse fly, which we really don't cover in this presentation, and the bottom left is sponging mouth parts of a house fly. So flies have different kinds of mouth parts, but we're concentrating on those that have these mouth parts that are modified in what are called stylets for penetrating skin. And this is just a little cartoon about some people would rather mosquitoes suck fat rather than blood. Okay, why do they need blood? Well, the basic thing is they need protein for egg production. That's the basic thing. And some eggs can be produced without blood feeding by accumulating nutrients from the larval stages. And for example, some mosquitoes can metabolize their wing muscles for the protein and get a few eggs that way. But the egg production is far less than if they have a blood meal. Okay, why are they important? And there's a positive side. A lot of people just think of the negative, but there's the positive side. And the positive side basically is pollination. And this is a male mosquito, and you can see the yellow dots all over its legs and proboscis and head and antenna and whatnot. And they go and suck nectar to get carbohydrates, sugars, for metabolism, for flying and whatnot. And but they'll go from flower to flower, and they do pollination. Here's a female mosquito, and the arrow points to pollenium. And pollenium are in orchids, they produce this massive amount of pollen that has a sticky sort of stalk on it, and pollinating insects get this stalk attached, and they go around and pollinate plants. And here's a no-see-um that is getting nectar and inadvertently pollinating flowers as well. But the next biggest thing is that they're a food source for many different animals. Here's a horsefly in a spider's web, and here's a bird. It's not eating a biting fly, but they eat lots of biting flies. And biting flies are in indigenous ceremonies. This is a mosquito mass of the Haida Gwaii, and you can see the long proboscis. And some of them are actually quite pretty. This is a tropical mosquito that has iridescent blue purplish colors and these big fluffy back legs. So a few of them can be aesthetically pleasing. And humans are so enamored by these biting flies that they build monuments to them, like this one of a mosquito in Manitoba. And of course, mosquitoes are a bit exaggerated. There's none that are big enough to carry off humans, and they don't have knives and forks to dine on humans. They use their stylets of their mouth parts. So, but on the negative side of things is that there's a loss of nutrients, blood, and loss of nutrients. There's a loss of vigor also because of less sleeping and less feeding times and whatnot, because the biting flies interfere with these things. And there can be allergic reactions as well, and secondary infections from scratching. But the biggest thing about them is that they're carriers of disease organisms. And so with the bites, you can see this person's arm is covered with fly bites. And these fly bites can lead to allergic reactions. And these allergic reactions are a lot more common with people who are new to an area. So newborn babies who haven't acquired immunity, tourists who come into an area that's strange to them, and recent immigrants. And all of these people, if they live in an area long enough, will become resistant, and most of them will not get such large reactions as they had initially. And there's very few people who've reached adulthood who have never been bitten several times by mosquitoes in all of the human existence. So, as I said, the bites, they tend to being itchy, and so they're scratching, and you get secondary infections, which can be problematic. And especially in the higher latitudes, black flies and mosquitoes are very numerous, and they can be a nuisance. I would say more than a slight nuisance. And then there's agricultural costs. With biting flies bothering animals, there's lower weight gains, and cows produce less milk, chickens produce fewer eggs, they have fewer offspring, there are deaths due to allergic reactions. And then there's, if you want to prevent them, there's costs with that, and if they get infections or diseases, then there's treatment costs. And this is a horsefly with on feeding on a horse. Okay, also pets get harassment and diseases. This is a dog that's being harassed by black flies. So they're important because, as I said, the transmission of disease organisms, and the biting flies are actually hosts of the disease, just like we are hosts of the disease, but we call them vectors because they transmit the diseases from person to person, as well as other animals. So there's two kinds of transfer of disease organisms. There's mechanical transfer, and there's biological replication and transfer. So with mechanical transfer, sometimes disease organisms can get on the mouth parts, and then when they feed on another host, it's theoretically possible to transfer those organisms to the host, and theoretically could get disease. However, it's been found that most disease organisms need multiple individuals in order to get an infection. A single or a few virus particles, for example, do not usually lead to infection. So, as I say, unlikely to cause disease. So biological replication and transfer is far more important, because the disease organism replicates within the body of the biting fly, and they move to the salivary glands, and when the biting fly uses the salivary glands, um, the organisms are in large numbers and they infest the host, and the chance of disease is quite high. So the disease organisms transmitted by biting flies, I've listed four groups of biting flies here: mosquitoes, black flies, no-see-ums, and horse flies. And you see that all of them can carry viruses, all of them can carry protozoans like malaria, and all of them can carry filarial nematodes, threadworms. Now, not all species carry all of these kinds of disease organisms, but in the world, you can see it's yes to all of the groups. But in certain parts of the world, like in northern Canada, filarial nematodes are usually not a problem, and neither are protozoans for mosquitoes. Okay, I wanted to mention arboviruses, and arboviruses is just a shortened term for arthropod-borne virus. And the virus goes in the arthropod host, or we call them vectors, and it duplicates there. And as I say, transferred to the salivary glands and then injected into other hosts that it feeds on, vertebrate hosts. And the vertebrate hosts, that's also replication of the organism, but that's in the blood supply so that it's available for the vectors to transmit the virus and have the life cycle continue. So with arboviruses in human hosts, it usually takes 2 to 15 days from infection to symptoms. And this is a general rule. Of course, there are a great deal of variation that occurs with various complications. And the reactions usually last only 3 to 4 days, but it can be more. And it varies a great deal of the symptoms. You can have no symptoms, which is the majority of cases. And then you can have mild symptoms like fever, headache, general feeling of malaise and not feeling well, and fatigue. And then you can get some moderate symptoms such as rashes and vomiting. And then you get severe symptoms such as swelling of the brain, encephalitis, or hemorrhagic fever. And these are the severe symptoms that usually cause death. So there's a whole range of reactions to infection. And it varies a lot about the immune system of the person. So the very young, the very old, those are I'm getting tongue-tied. Immunologically suppressed, say if they have other diseases or they have an organ transplant, they're more susceptible, and the reactions are more severe. Okay, the arboviruses themselves, there's several families of them. I've listed them here. See, the second one transmits dengue fever, West Nile, and Zika. And the fourth one is Western equine encephalitis. And these two diagrams at the bottom show what they look like if you could see them. But they're extremely small, and you need a high-powered electron microscope to be able to detect them. Okay, there's complications of how the arboviruses are transmitted through the ecosystem. So you've got to have the vectors. And there are several different species of vectors, and some are minor vectors and some are major vectors. It varies with their feeding habits, their host preferences, and all kinds of things like that. And one of the problems is that there can be transovarian transmission. That means that the virus gets into, say, a female mosquito, it goes through her body, goes into the ovaries, goes into the eggs, and so her offspring already have the virus, and they don't need to feed on infected host to get the virus. They already have it, and then it's transmitted, it's permanently in that species. Then, of course, there's the vertebrate hosts, and they're various hosts. Some are major and some are minor, and the minor ones tend to be dead-end hosts because they either get extremely sick and die, or they are not very commonly fed upon, and so the virus doesn't continue its life cycle from them very often. So in human hosts, we have transmission by blood. So you have problems if you're giving blood bank donations for transfusions, or organ transplants can be compromised with these viruses. And it's also possible for some of these viruses to get in other body fluids like saliva and semen. So they can be, it's not just the blood in some cases. Okay, this is the end of part one. If you found this useful, then you can find part two, and I will talk about mosquitoes, the family Culicidae. Thank you for your attention.